The world doesn't use violence to make women comply. It uses something far more precise. It rewards your softness, it rewards your warmth, it rewards your ability to make everyone in the room feel comfortable, and then it tells you, over and over, that these things are you. So over time, many women don't get their spine broken. They bury the real self, and then they take that buried version and call it maturity. So what actually happens isn't the world demands that women bend. What actually happens is, while still standing, the inside has already bent. Today we're going to talk about 4 women, Beauvoir, Didion, Sontag, Fallaci, not because they were great, because something different happened inside them. What we're here to dissect is that difference. The British psychoanalyst Winnicott proposed a pair of concepts, the true self and the false self. The true self is your most essential impulse, feeling, judgment. The version of you that hasn't been filtered through anything external. The false self is the shell you construct to survive the environment, compliant, predictable, not going to cause problems. Winnicott was clear, building a false self isn't inherently pathological. It is a protection mechanism. When the external environment is too dangerous for the true self, the false self comes out to guard the door. But here is a clinical fact. This system activates for women at a rate that far exceeds any other population. Too intelligent, called aggressive. Too clear about what you want, called selfish, refuse to be defined. Called cold, called difficult, called something. That is hard to name, but is obviously your problem. Shame is the primary tool. The hunger for approval is the second. The terror of being too much is the third. Almost every woman carries all 3, not because they are weak, because all 3 were systematically installed. Most women don't consciously choose to let the false self take over. The true self simply becomes too costly to maintain. Bit by bit, the false self begins to deputize then, eventually to impersonate. And the most dangerous moment is when you catch yourself performing. It is when you can no longer tell the difference between the performance and the real thing. So the question becomes, why didn't this system fully rewrite some women's interiors? The psychologist Kohut proposed a concept, self-cohesion, the structural density of the internal self. He didn't mean these people don't get hurt. He meant when they are hurt, there is still a dense enough core present. External pressure hits it and gets deflected, not absorbed. But there is an easy misreading here that needs to be cleared up. High self-cohesion doesn't mean invulnerable, doesn't mean they don't collapse. The precise meaning is this: even at the most dangerous moments, she still has a way to maintain some form of continuity of self. That sense of I am still here, it doesn't go out. This is the shared foundation beneath all 4 of our subjects. But the way each of them maintained it, completely different. Beauvoir's true self did face its first threat from any specific man. It faced it from language itself. She noticed early the words used to describe women, gentle, dependent, intuitive, weren't describing them. They were prescribing them. Every word was a rib of a cage. Her response wasn't anger, it was cognitive surgery. What the second sex did wasn't defend women. It dismantled the construction logic of the cage itself, tracing it back through myth, biology, economic structure, literary tradition. She wanted every single rib to become visible. When cognition is sharp enough, the named thing loses its power over you. That was her mechanism for protecting the true self, dissect the language of oppression until it can no longer function. But here is a clinical precision that needs to be stated. Cognitive penetration can dismantle external structures. It cannot automatically repair the impulse toward compromise inside intimacy. Her private letters to Sartre are the fracture line. Jealousy is there, need is there. The silences that come from choosing to stay quiet in order to hold a relationship together. Those are there too. This isn't a contradiction in her. This is a clinical fact. A woman can deconstruct the entire construction logic of female subjugation and still not be immune to the impulse, inside an intimate relationship, to bend just a little so as not to lose someone. Cognitive penetration was her protective structure. It just could protect everything. Didion, psychological structure, is the hardest of the 4 to dissect and the easiest to misread as a narrative of simple toughness. Let us clear that misreading out first. In 2003, her husband died suddenly at the dinner table. She didn't scream. She didn't collapse in the ordinary sense. She started taking notes. The book that came out of it, The Year of Magical Thinking, is a book about grief, but its narrative logic is surgical. She studied her own grief the way a clinician studies a case. It is easy to call this a highly integrated self, but there is a more accurate, more honest clinical description. She didn't not break. She converted the breaking into something that could be observed, named, and delayed in its consuming of her. That was her method of maintaining self-continuity, not through strength, through relentlessly rebuilding. In language, a position from which she could still watch. I am still here. Watching all of this, she couldn't bend because that observer position never evacuated. But the cost, a person who lives permanently under her own gaze, is very hard to genuinely penetrate. Her self-cohesion was extreme, but that extremity, more than a sign of stability, was a sustained, exhausting effort to prevent herself from disappearing entirely. There was something in Sontag that preceded all her theory. An instinct, almost to be interpreted is to be destroyed. Not a metaphor. The actual operating logic of her personality. She formalized it in against interpretation. Art shouldn't be reduced to meaning. The sensory experience itself is the point. But behind that theory was a more private truth. She understood with terrible clarity that once a woman gets figured out, once she has been defined and filed away, she is dead to that person. Her method of maintaining subjectivity wasn't building a stable self-definition. It was perpetual escape ahead of definition, faster than any label turning before any single framework could close around her. This is Jungian individuation, becoming yourself rather than anyone's expectation of you. But Sontag pushed it to an extreme. She was wary even of becoming the symbol Sontag. Some people survive by building an identity. Sontag survived by refusing to let any identity complete its occupation of her. But here is a structural tension that has to be named. In refusing to be defined, she protected a real, soft core on the inside. But that core, precisely because it was so heavily guarded, was almost never seen. Her late relationship with Annie Leibovitz was a rare breach, the place where she allowed herself to be reached. The public only ever saw the blade of refusal. She used escape to protect her true self. But that true self spent almost an entire life unreachable by anyone. Fallaci is the most direct of the four. She learned something early in her career that functioned as a permanent operating principle: bend and disappear. She interviewed on battlefields, walked into dictators' offices, sat across from military commanders. Every time, the other person waited for the woman to yield. Every time, she attacked, with Kissinger. She pressed him until he called Vietnam a useless, foolish war. With Khomeini, she tore off the enforced hijab in the middle of the interview. Her rage wasn't an emotion. It was structural, load-bearing material. The actual substance holding up her entire psychological architecture. But inside that structure, there was one single soft point: Alexandros Panagoulis, her Greek lover, a man who had attempted to assassinate a military dictator and served years in prison for it. He died in 1976. She wrote a man for him. It is the only book she ever wrote in which Eros fully escaped. No armor, no posture of attack, only mourning. After Panagoulis died, Fallaci became progressively more enclosed, progressively more furious. The last decade of her life was written largely in isolation and hatred. When rage is a person's only load-bearing material, and they lose the one outlet that allowed them to be soft, the rage starts consuming the structure it was built to hold up. Her refusal to bend was real, but her final years were a person using rage to fill every space left by everything she could no longer have. That is not an accusation. That is the internal logic of the structure she built. Now we can state it clearly. The world bends women using three psychological instruments: shame, the hunger for approval, the terror of being too much. These instruments operate inside the personality, constructing a false self and then letting that false self begin to impersonate a soul. These four women were not without a false self. They just never surrendered sovereignty over themselves to it. Cognitive penetration is a protective structure. Obsessive self-observation is a maintenance mechanism. The terror of being defined is escape propulsion. Rage is fuel, four materials, four chemical reactions. Four ways the true self survived under extreme pressure. None of it was talent, none of it was personality. In Jung's language, individuation forced itself into existence inside a system that was not designed to permit it. But there is one final clinical fact that needs to be stated. Each of these 4 protective structures carries intrinsic cost. Cognitive penetration stops at the threshold of intimacy. Observational density blocks the possibility of being genuinely permeated. Escaping ahead of definition means the true self spends a lifetime barely reachable. Rage as fuel turns inward when the outlet is lost. This isn't a judgment on what they did wrong. It is a statement that no method of keeping the true self alive is weightless. Every woman carries these 3 materials inside her. Shame, the hunger for approval, the terror of being too much. That is not your failing. That was installed, but equally true, the penetrating clarity is in you. The capacity to observe is in you. The instinct that refuses to be completely boxed in is in you. And the rage, however small, however carefully contained, that has never fully gone out in you, is in you too. What we call not bending is in the absence of adaptation. It is what remains after years of adapting. When you still haven't handed over the final say on who you are, the question was never what materials you have. It is who gets to decide what they become.